Hey friends! Welcome back! You are, of course, listening to the Animal Nerd podcast, and I am, of course, your reluctantly human host. For once, I don't think I have any housekeeping to get out of the way up front, so let's get straight into this week's episode. So this is the story of an animal who I was a really big fan of when I was a kid. I stumbled across her online when I was googling random animal-related things, which is how I spent a lot of my childhood, and when this particular animal first popped up on that ancient computer screen, I was obsessed. I fell in love. And then I completely forgot she existed and went on with my life. That is, until recently, when I came up with the idea for this podcast, and I was trying to come up with animals and stories to feature, and I just suddenly remembered the hours I spent as a child looking at pictures of this one specific dog, and then parroting everything I'd read about her to my family and realised, oh yeah, that's literally what this podcast is. Just me nerding out about a specific animal to anyone who's vaguely interested. So, of course, I added her straight to the list, and now here we are. Today, I'm going to share with you the story of Faith, who at one point was declared to be not only the world's most popular dog, but also the world's most photographed animal. Unless you're really young, there's a pretty good chance you've already heard of Faith or seen pictures or videos of her, especially if you were in any way online like 15 or so years ago. She wasn't given those titles for no reason. Faith was a viral star online and in the media, and became a full-blown international celebrity, being covered by news outlets from more countries than I can count, and travelling back and forth across the US to appear in front of crowds of thousands of adoring spectators. But Faith's start in life was far from the glitz and glamour of an international superstar. In fact, Faith very nearly didn't survive. Faith came into the world in December 2002, an unplanned litter born to a Chow Chow named Princess and a father of mixed Labrador, Beagle and German Pointer blood. And as soon as she was born, it was clear that Faith was different from her litter mates. Faith was born with only 3 legs. Her front right leg was pretty much completely absent, although she did have a tiny little nub where it should have been, but for whatever reason it had just never developed. And that wasn't all. Faith did have her front left leg, but it was completely deformed. It was smaller than it should have been, and it completely lacked an elbow joint, and was pointing backwards. It was clear at just a glance that Faith would never be able to walk like a normal dog, and her mother Princess knew this too. So much so that when Faith was only about 3 weeks old, Princess tried to kill her, suffocating her by sitting on her head. And Princess would have succeeded had it not been for the intervention of a 16-year-old boy named Reuben Stringfellow, who snatched Faith out from underneath her mother and tucked her safely beneath his football jersey, saving her life. It was obvious that Faith couldn't be raised by her mother anymore, but there was one slight problem. Earlier that day, Reuben's mother Jude had specifically told him not to bring any of the puppies home. But what other option was there? Just leave her to die? Not a chance. So, despite being expressly forbidden from doing so, Reuben took Faith home with him. And once he showed the tiny scrap of fur to his mother, she could hardly say no. But that didn't mean Faith was safe. She was so tiny and so weak, shaking with fear and cold and still struggling with the after effects of being smothered. Jude knew as soon as she saw the little puppy that there was a good chance she wouldn't survive the night. But she also knew that this tiny yellow dog deserved a chance at life, and that's exactly what she was going to give her. Obviously, Faith didn't yet have her name. Early on, she was just known by the family as Yellow Dog because, well, she was a yellow dog. The obvious reaction to being presented with a puppy in this state would be to rush her to the vet, but it was 7 o'clock at night and they were closed, so instead the family's 3 children, Reuben and his younger sisters Laura and Katie, took it in turns to nurse the puppy through the night. And in what was nothing short of a miracle, Yellow Dog did live to see the morning. But that didn't mean they were out of the woods yet. They took her to the vet as soon as they could, but were warned to bring a blanket with them so that if the puppy needed to be put to sleep, they could cover her body. And in truth, I think a lot of people would have chosen to have a puppy with such severe birth defects put down. With no front legs, or no usable ones at least, it was obvious that she'd never be able to walk properly, and can a dog in that state even have quality of life? The Stringfellows certainly thought so, or at least that it was worth giving her a chance, even though doing so was certainly not the easy option. Yellow Dog was so young and so weak that she required around-the-clock care. She was initially unable to eat or drink for herself and needed to be given formula, as at 3 weeks old she wasn't weaned. And since it was January and Faith didn't have her mother to snuggle up to anymore, she was instead kept warm via a rotation of tumble-dried towels, one always being warmed up while the other was being used as her bedding. Caring for this puppy was a full-time job, quite literally. Jude worked as a professor of English, but she couldn't leave Yellow Dog alone while she went off to work, and as a single mother there was no one else to look after the puppy while her kids were at school. The obvious answer was to take Yellow Dog into work with her, but her bosses wouldn't allow it. And faced with the choice between keeping her job and keeping the tiny dog she and her children had fallen in love with, she decided to go with her heart and quit her job, instead managing to pick up work from home as a part-time paralegal and part-time tutor, although this meant that money was tight and at least once their electricity was briefly cut off when they fell behind on their payments. But as far as the family were concerned, this dog was worth it. She was special and they believed that she'd come into their lives for a reason. So they continued to treat this tiny puppy with love and care, and eventually her condition began to improve. She began to gain strength and put on weight, although for that first week it was touch and go as to whether or not she'd survive. Eventually, Yellow Dog did begin to move around. She'd scoot around, propelling herself with her hind legs, with her chest and chin on the floor. It couldn't have been the most comfortable way of getting around, but it was something, and the children were determined to make Faith more mobile, even constructing makeshift mobility aids out of old roller skates and skateboards. And at some point, this little dog was given a proper name, Faith, because her family had faith in her and faith that she would walk. And one day she did. One day in that first spring, Faith got up on her 2 back legs and walked over to the food bowl to eat. She herself didn't seem to think it was that big a deal, but it very much was. She taught herself to walk upright, something that a lot of people probably would have thought impossible. And once she'd cracked it, that was just how Faith moved, walking around on 2 legs like a tiny furry human. Although Faith is often described as having taught herself to walk, and by all accounts it seems she really did, but I don't think that means the efforts of her loved ones to help her should be discounted. Faith received plenty of encouragement and assistance from her family, and without that love and kindness, who knows if she'd ever been able to make the leap from scooting about to walking upright. Although you'll often see Faith described as walking upright, including in this podcast, she didn't actually stand entirely upright. Instead, she stood and walked at about 3/4 tall, which allowed her to balance more easily and put less pressure on her joints than walking totally straight would have done. Still, it meant she was far taller than she would have been on 4 legs. By the time she was fully grown, she stood at 37 inches tall, which for my fellow non-Americans is about 94 centimetres. And Faith soon discovered that being tall has certain advantages, when she decided to celebrate her first ever Thanksgiving by stealing the roast turkey straight from the table, which she then took to her favourite hiding spot under a bed to share with the other dogs. Her family stopped serving food from the dining table after that, since nothing within Faith's reach was safe. Faith would also raid any bin she could find if it smelt promisingly of discarded food. So Faith was thriving and everything was coming together perfectly, right? Well, there was one slight issue. The family's landlord had a strict no pets policy, and owning a puppy was enough of a violation, without taking into consideration the fact that they already had 2 other pets living in their house before Faith, a dog named Matrix and a cat named Nova. They didn't necessarily choose to get Nova as much as had her thrust upon them while visiting the vet for Matrix's annual health check, as she was a stray kitten in need of a new home. And there's also a story as to how they ended up with Matrix that I don't really feel comfortable sharing here because it centres around some very personal things, but that was also a case where they didn't really have a choice. This wasn't a family who were just irresponsibly getting animals they weren't allowed to keep. In both cases, or all 3 now if you include Faith, they had very valid reasons for those pets being there, and so I don't really want to pass judgment on that. And I think most people in the same situations would have made the same choice. Whenever their landlord visited, they'd hide Nova and claim that Matrix belonged to a friend. But given how famous Faith would go on to become, and the fact that her owners' full names and often their faces too were always included in coverage of her, I don't imagine it was particularly easy to keep on fleecing their landlord. I wish I knew more about how that went down. Like, they did eventually move to somewhere that did allow dogs, but I'm pretty sure Faith was at least receiving local media attention before they did, so I'd imagine their landlord found out eventually. But I feel like you have to make an exception for a 2-legged dog, right? But Faith certainly didn't seem to mind the fact that she was a contraband pet. She was just a normal dog, going for walks, chasing squirrels, taking up more than her fair share of the bed every night, and shamelessly begging for food from anyone who dared eat in her vicinity without offering her a bite. Her favourite food was cheese, although like most dogs she'd eat just about anything she could. People stared at her everywhere she went, because of course they did. She was a functionally 2-legged dog, walking around like a person. But Faith didn't seem to care that she moved about differently to other dogs, and she certainly never seemed to mind the fact that wherever she went she became the centre of attention. And realising how much joy Faith could bring to other people, Jude decided to call up the local news station to see if they'd like to feature Faith as a feel-good story. And you're expecting me to say here that they immediately said yes and flocked to film her, but that's not what happened. For whatever weird reason, they were completely uninterested and turned Jude down, leaving her with the promise that they might call back if they ever had a slow news day and needed to fill time. And can you imagine knowing that you have this incredible, completely unique dog, possibly the only bipedal dog in the entire world, and being told that no one would be interested in that? Excuse me? Eventually, though, there was a news day slow enough that the studio decided to send a cameraman over to get some B-roll of Faith and a couple of sound bites for a short little feature. And I can only assume that the news team's initial disinterest in Faith stemmed from some kind of miscommunication somewhere along the line. Because the second the cameraman arrived and actually saw Faith and the way she moved, he immediately phoned the studio and frantically explained that this wasn't just a dog hopping about on her hind legs. This was a dog fully walking around everywhere like a human. A dog with no real front legs. And suddenly, the studio seemed a lot more interested. So much so that once the footage was at the studio, the anchorwoman insisted that they send it to the Associated Press, which would see Faith's story being covered across the US and beyond. But of course this local station, K4TV, would still be the first outlet to feature Faith, with their coverage of her going live across Oklahoma City that very evening, the 23rd of June 2003. Needless to say, Faith was an instant hit, and her family were pretty much instantly faced with a barrage of calls from newspapers, magazines, websites, TV stations, pretty much anything you can think of. She was only 6 months old, but Faith was already a star. Everyone wanted to cover the story of the miracle dog who refused to be left out of life. It wasn't all sunshine and roses, though. Faith's career may have been taking off, but at the same time, the one front leg she did have was causing issues. The tissue was beginning to die, which can lead to all kinds of problems. So when she was 7 months old, the leg was amputated. Anyone who's ever known an amputee dog will know that losing a leg doesn't tend to bother them at all. And it was no different for Faith, because despite the fact that she now only had 2 legs, her front leg had never been usable and it had also never really grown with the rest of her. Even if it hadn't been so deformed, it would still have been far too small to be usable. The leg had quite literally been dead weight, and Faith didn't seem to mind at all saying goodbye to it. And it certainly didn't interrupt her blossoming career as a media darling. Not long after her first TV broadcast, Faith, along with her humans of course, was invited to visit the K4TV station, since she'd pretty much been a daily topic of discussion since her first appearance. This was just the first of what would become many trips to different TV stations and studios across the country, and it went very much the same way as all of her future visits would. She was greeted by just about every single member of staff, and given more treats and cuddles than any dog could dream of. And Faith was an angel, patient with every single one of her adoring fans, and not remotely fussed by the noise or chaos of the busy TV studio. Most other dogs would have been completely overwhelmed by that kind of environment. But then Faith isn't most dogs. She took everything in her bipedal stride, and seemed to love every second of it. And that's a thread that would continue throughout Faith's career. No matter where she ended up going or what she ended up doing, she took to it all like a duck to water. Well, that's not quite true. There was one thing that Faith didn't take to like a duck to water, and that, ironically enough, is water. When Faith was still young, her family took her to a lake to try and teach her how to swim, and Faith was apparently an enthusiastic student, at least at first, constantly jumping into the water and seemingly having a great time of it. However, despite her best attempts and the encouragement of her family, Faith could never quite master the art of swimming. Like, at all. It seems there are some things in life that do just require more than 2 legs and endless determination, and doggy paddle is one of them. So yeah, Faith wasn't cut out for a career in competitive swimming, but Jude had her eye on a different vocation for her altogether. Pretty much as soon as they got Faith, Jude had hoped that one day Faith would be able to train as a therapy dog, so that she could visit places like hospitals and schools to bring love, inspiration and joy to people who needed it. And wanting to do things properly, she approached a professional dog trainer who had experience in therapy dog training. And this person took one look at Faith and immediately declared that she would not work with her, that this dog had no chance of ever becoming a proper therapy dog. It didn't matter that Faith had the perfect disposition for the job, it didn't matter that Faith's disability meant she had something in common with the people she might help. What mattered, as far as the trainer was concerned, was that a therapy dog couldn't have 2 legs. And try as I might, I cannot wrap my head around why. What part of a therapy dog's duties actually requires 4 legs? I just genuinely can't understand it. And neither could Jude. So, knowing Faith's potential, she decided to skirt around the official process and just buy her own therapy-esque harness and patches, and knock up her own bootleg version of a therapy dog's uniform. And it doesn't seem that anyone ever really questioned it. And while I absolutely understand why she did it, I do probably need to include a disclaimer here that I'm absolutely not endorsing people pretending their pet is a therapy animal or an emotional support animal or anything like that, if they're not actually one. Refusing Faith just because of her disability was ridiculous, but for the most part there is a good reason behind the qualification criteria for therapy animals, just to be clear. But as well as enabling Faith to start visiting schools and hospitals, her position as a definitely totally legit therapy dog also meant that Jude was able to return to her teaching career, as Faith was now allowed to accompany her, and Faith also seemed to love her new job as a therapy dog for Jude's students. And speaking of Faith and schools, even before her fame took off, she became the unofficial mascot of Reuben's high school football team, making appearances at every home game and most of the away ones too, and she was always just as loved by the opposing team as she was by her own. Not long after she'd first been on the local news, Faith was picked up for her first appearance on a proper national TV show when she was featured in an episode of Ripley's Believe It or Not, which led to Faith being seen by more eyes than ever before and being picked up for more and more shows, each one bigger than the last. With TV shows of all kinds vying to get Faith on as a guest or feature, which involved Faith, and her humans of course, having to travel across the US to various filming locations. But as always seems to be the case with Faith, she adored it all and didn't bat an eyelid at travelling by plane. In fact, Faith loved airports and air travel so much that she'd be disappointed if she got into the car and it turned out to just be something mundane and everyday like a trip to the pet shop or the vets. So much so that more than once on a trip like this, they'd also take Faith to the airport, give her a chance to go around and do some of her favourite things, and then go home again. Over the course of her career, Faith would end up taking over 200 flights, visiting almost every state in the US, and being met by well over 500,000 people in person. And all of this travel wasn't just for TV. She also did plenty of visits to expos, schools, churches, conferences, hospitals, charity events, sporting events, as well as plenty of inspirational and educational talks. Although Faith wasn't the one doing the talking, of course, that was usually Jude, who eventually would become a full-time motivational speaker and writer thanks to Faith. But when it comes to mapping out Faith's rise to global stardom, there's one single event that catapulted her to never-before-seen levels of fame, and it started in May 2006, when Jude got a phone call from the producers of The Oprah Winfrey Show, probably one of, if not the biggest TV show in the world at the time. But there was a catch. Jude wasn't allowed to tell anyone about Faith's latest booking, because the producers wanted Faith to be a surprise for Oprah, so all of the B-roll filming was done in secret. And when it came to the live show, they scripted Oprah's introduction to Faith to say that she was a little girl, about 4 years old, and the fact that she could even walk out onto the stage was a miracle. And to be fair, none of it was a lie. They just never told her that Faith wasn't a little human girl. After her introduction was read out, Faith made her appearance on stage accompanied by Laura, and in that second, Oprah, and probably every one of the millions of people watching, fell in love. The clip later went viral online, spreading Faith's fame yet further. Faith was kind of permanently linked to the Oprah Winfrey Show in a lot of people's minds after that. She added the Oprah dog to her list of nicknames, and "Is that the dog of Oprah?" became one of the most common greetings Faith and her family would get while out and about for years afterwards. And Oprah would go on to say that Faith was one of her all-time favourite guests. That episode of the Oprah Winfrey Show was so widely watched, and Faith was so universally adored, that in its aftermath, Jude was receiving over 500 emails per hour. Luckily, by this time it wasn't just Jude and her kids doing all the work to build Faith's career. Not long before her appearance on Oprah, they'd hired a manager to help deal with the public's ever-growing demand for Faith. In 2007, she even went on tour with Ozzy Osbourne. As much as Faith loved her life as a jet-setting hound, I suppose there's only so many plane trips a dog can make before things start going a little wrong. Perhaps the biggest example of this was in 2007, when American Airlines managed to lose Faith. Yeah, straight up, they just completely lost a celebrity for multiple hours until they managed to track her down. Eventually they worked out that Faith, who at that time had been transported in the cargo, had been put onto the wrong flight, and they hadn't realised until Jude's plane had landed, and Faith just wasn't there. After the drama and bad press of losing Faith, the airline let Faith travel alongside Jude, even giving Faith her own seat, and it was pretty much always the exact same seat. Like, Faith fully considered this particular seat to be hers. So you can imagine her disgust when she bounded onto a plane, ready for a new adventure, and found some random person already sitting there. On this particular occasion, Faith and Jude had been assigned different seats, but Faith was not having any of it. She anchored herself to the floor so she couldn't be moved and started barking at this poor guy for daring to sit in the seat listed on his ticket. Jude did manage eventually to get Faith to where they were supposed to be sitting, but that didn't stop Faith from making a fuss. Fortunately though, it turned out that this guy's wife was a fan of Faith's, and they were more than happy to swap seats to make the famous Oprah dog happy. Yeah, Faith could be a bit of a diva at times, but can you really blame her? Another piece of plane-related drama was when a connecting flight was cancelled due to a bad snowstorm, and so staff at the airport sorted emergency accommodation for the would-be travellers, since there was no chance of the plane taking off until the next morning. Doesn't sound like much of a big deal, right? That kind of thing happens a lot. However, somehow whoever's job it was to book somewhere for Jude and Faith had apparently completely forgotten to check whether or not the hotel they booked allowed dogs. And it wasn't until Jude and Faith arrived there that they were informed this was very much not a pet-friendly establishment, and under no circumstances would Faith be allowed to stay here. It didn't matter that there was a blizzard outside and they had nowhere else to go. The hotel manager just would not budge. No dogs allowed, no matter how cute, well-behaved or famous they might be. Once again though, Faith's fame came to the rescue when an international businessman waltzed into the hotel lobby and immediately recognised Faith. The fact that Faith was an adorable canine celebrity wasn't enough to change the hotel manager's mind, but the persuasion and money of an ultra-wealthy client with a long-standing reservation certainly was, and ultimately they were allowed to stay the night. Faith was probably the most famous dog in the world, if not the most famous animal. And while of course she did do plenty of media appearances and in-person events, it was in her work as a therapy dog that Faith really shone. She travelled across the country to visit schools, hospitals and army bases, among plenty of other locations. If it was somewhere where people would benefit from meeting a two-legged dog with a wide smile and sunny disposition, then she'd be there, spreading hope and love to those who needed it most. A lot of the work she did was with people who'd gone through an amputation. Since being an amputee herself, she was proof that losing a limb or two wasn't the end of the world, that you could still live a full, beautiful, joyous life no matter what you'd been through. I really hope that that dog trainer who turned Faith down as a puppy and said that she could never be a therapy dog saw what Faith went on to do, and the difference she made in the world. And that it caused them to rethink their approach to disability. Or at the very least, I hope they were embarrassed. I certainly would be. And eventually, Faith did become a legit therapy dog. 3 years after being turned away by that professional trainer, Faith was named an official therapy dog by the US Army. Oh, and speaking of military accolades, as well as the therapy dog thing, Faith was also named a sergeant in a ceremony attended by thousands of troops. And while this was just an honorary title, like they obviously weren't just going to throw her into the midst of an actual war, it was still a real title. And it also meant that she outranked her original rescuer Reuben, who by this point had enlisted. I could go on and on about Faith's achievements, but by this point it would just be a list of places she visited, TV shows she appeared on, organisations she worked with, and even then I still don't think I could do justice to just how much this one dog managed to do in her life, or the number of lives she changed. I don't think I could convey that just by rattling off a list of names at you. Faith made the world a better place, and helped to inspire countless people around the world. Not bad for a little yellow dog who very nearly didn't survive her first month of life. When Faith got a little older, she had to start slowing down slightly with her visits. Although thanks to a high-quality diet and carefully selected supplements, she remained free from pain despite the pressure put on her joints by the way she walked. And though she did slow down, she was still regularly travelling across the country to brighten people's days. Like, she was still doing far more than any normal dog could cope with. She, and her humans of course, also partnered with an organisation that made mobility aids for pets, giving them out free to animals who needed them. Faith herself never really needed anything like that. She got around just fine on her own 2 feet, and because she'd still been growing when she first started walking, her body had adapted well to the strain it put on her joints. Faith was immortalised as a stuffed toy, and there were even plans to make a film about her life and an animated TV show starring her, though neither of those projects ever made it to fruition, unfortunately. Jude also mentions in Faith's memoir that she had plans to open up a series of animal shelters across the US, one in every state, in honour of Faith. They'd be called Faith Shelters, and would be based specifically in areas that didn't already have enough rescue centres to deal with the number of strays. But again, it doesn't look like that ever happened. Although, of course, Faith already had an absolutely beautiful legacy in the form of the lives she changed and the people she helped. And even though she never had any of her own shelters opened up, Faith still went to events to help other animal rescue organisations. When Faith was about 9 years old, she finally retired from her duties as a public figure, and a very well-deserved retirement it was too, although she would occasionally still do private local sessions. And although for so long Faith's disability didn't cause any suffering, she did eventually go on to experience some pain, although for a while they were able to manage it through medication. And then, when she was almost 12 years old, Faith's family had to make the awful decision to have Faith put to sleep. She was in pain, she struggled to balance when she was going to the toilet, she was beginning to develop cancerous tumours. It was her time. On the 22nd of September 2014, Faith peacefully slipped away with Jude by her side. Having to make the decision to say goodbye to an animal you love is always awful. But I hope Faith's family were able to find at least some peace in knowing what an incredible impact Faith had on the world, how she defied all the odds and proved her detractors wrong. There were some who thought Faith should never have been given a chance at life, that she should have been put to sleep as a puppy because there was no way a dog with such severe birth defects could ever live a happy, pain-free life. But this little yellow dog and the humans and animals who became her family proved that with enough love, courage and faith, anything is possible. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please let me know. As ever, all of our socials and contact information will be linked down in the show notes, if you want to reach out. I have a long list of animals and species and topics that I want to cover in episodes, but I always appreciate suggestions for what you want to hear me talk about, so please feel free to share those with us. At the end of last week's episode, I talked about one of my main goals with this podcast, but in case you didn't hear it, I thought I may as well mention it here as well. Basically, I'm involved with an animal sanctuary called the Little Rescue Zoo. They specialise in exotic pets, as well as animals of all species who have disabilities, birth defects, or health or behavioural issues that make them difficult to find suitable homes for, although no animal's quite as unique as Faith just yet. And the reason I bring this up is, firstly, because I want to give the sanctuary a shout out. I really believe in the work they do, and the more support they have, the more animals they're able to help. But more specifically, because if this podcast ever earns any money, then 100% of that is going to be donated to the sanctuary rather than going to myself. Which means that just by listening to this podcast, you're helping to rescue animals in need and give them the best life possible, so thank you. And if you would like to help support the podcast and by extension the sanctuary, then please do whatever you can. Leave us a 5-star review on your podcast player and subscribe to the show, share it with your animal loving friends. If you're listening to this via YouTube, you can subscribe to our channel, leave a comment and like the video. That all helps get the algorithm to push it out to more people, and the more eyes and ears we can get on this podcast, the more we can help the sanctuary, and it's completely free, so what's not to love? Oh, and before I forget, as ever, all my sources will be linked down below, but I always like to give a shout out to my main sources in the episode itself. And in this case, that was the book Faith Walks, A Memoir of a Beautiful Life by Jude Stringfellow, who obviously was Faith's owner. It's on Amazon, I got it on Kindle, and I'll have a link to it in case you want to buy your own copy and get to know Faith's story on an even deeper level. It goes into way more detail than I could ever get into in this podcast, so yeah, if you want to learn more about Faith from the person who knew her the best, then be sure to check that out. And I think that's everything I needed to say. So I'll just say once again thank you for listening, and I will see you next Tuesday. Stay wild, friends.